For decades, Canada and the US have been like siblings, close, sometimes bickering, but always relying on each other. Their economies, cultures, and even families are deeply intertwined, with millions of jobs and livelihoods depending on the smooth flow of goods and trust across the world's longest undefended border. This partnership has weathered storms before, but always emerged stronger, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared prosperity. Canadian steel has been a backbone of American industry, especially in cars, buildings, and bridges. Every day, thousands of tons of steel cross the border, fueling the factories and construction sites that keep both nations moving forward. It's not just metal, it's the material that shapes skylines and connects communities. The North American auto industry is a cross-border dance, with Canadian steel as a key partner. From the first spark on the assembly line to the final polish on a new car, this partnership is seamless, efficient, and essential for keeping costs down and quality high. Proximity and trust made this supply chain seamless. Steel from Ontario to Detroit was as easy as a tourist crossing Niagara Falls. The border was more a gateway than a barrier, with goods and ideas flowing freely in both directions day and night. US car makers built their schedules around this flow, confident the steel would always arrive on time. Just-in-time delivery wasn't just a strategy, it was a way of life, allowing factories to run smoothly and workers to count on steady paychecks. Disruption seemed unthinkable until it happened. Suddenly, the gears that kept this system humming ground to a halt, leaving workers and businesses scrambling for answers. A single policy decision from Washington shattered the trust, treating Canada as an outsider. Overnight, a neighbor became a rival, and the rules of the game changed without warning. Tariffs hit like a sledgehammer, upending decades of cooperation and turning steel from a symbol of partnership into a source of pain. The shockwaves rippled through boardrooms, union halls, and kitchen tables on both sides of the border. The fallout wasn't just economic, it was personal. Jobs, families, and entire communities were suddenly at risk. For many, the uncertainty was overwhelming, as the future they'd counted on was thrown into doubt. The crisis exposed how fragile our interconnected world really is. What once seemed unbreakable could be bent or even broken by a single stroke of a pen. And soon, this mess could show up in the price tag of your next car. The consequences of a fractured partnership don't just stay in boardrooms, they land right in your driveway, affecting us all. The trouble started with a 25% tariff on steel imports, a move that sent shockwaves through the global steel market and rattled long-standing trade relationships. The idea was simple: protect American industry from foreign competition and revive domestic steel production. The White House called it a national security measure, arguing that a strong steel sector was vital for defense. But in reality, it hit America's closest allies, like Canada, the hardest straining diplomatic ties. US manufacturers, especially in the auto and construction sectors, saw costs rise and supply chains falter as imported steel became more expensive and harder to source. The numbers told a grim story: 75,000 jobs lost in steel-using industries, just to create a mere 1,000 new jobs in steel production itself. The math simply didn't add up for most American workers. Then, in June 2025, the US doubled down, raising tariffs to a staggering 50%. The announcement sent shockwaves through boardrooms and union halls alike. For Canada, whose steel exports mostly go south, this was catastrophic. Canadian mills had relied on the US market for decades, and suddenly, their biggest customer was out of reach. The new tariff made Canadian steel commercially non-viable overnight. Plants that once ran around the clock now sat idle, and workers faced layoffs. With steel at $900 per ton, a 50% tariff added $450, pricing Canada out of the market and leaving shipments stranded at the border. Algoma Steel's CEO said only a return to $2,000 per ton prices could offset the cost, a fantasy in today's market where global demand is sluggish and prices are stuck at historic lows. The move left everyone asking, why target your closest ally, a fellow NATO and NORAD partner, when both countries depend on each other for economic and security reasons? The policy ignored the reality that the North American auto industry is one giant integrated factory floor with parts and materials crossing the border multiple times before a car is finished. Instead of helping, the tariffs threw a massive wrench into the works, disrupting production schedules and forcing companies to scramble for alternatives. Both Canadian producers and US manufacturers were left scrambling, facing uncertainty, layoffs, and mounting costs as they tried to adapt to the new reality. The result? Chaos on both sides of the border as businesses, workers, and entire communities struggled to make sense of a policy that seemed to hurt everyone it touched. The 50% tariff hit Canada's steel industry like a five-alarm fire. Factories built around US customers suddenly had nowhere to send their steel. The math no longer worked. Every shipment meant a loss. Warehouses filled up, and layoffs began almost immediately. Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie cut 35 jobs within days, a warning sign of deeper trouble. Communities braced for economic fallout, realizing the danger of relying on a single customer. There was no quick pivot. Specialized steel for North American cars isn't easily sold elsewhere. The shutdown felt like a betrayal, decades of partnerships severed overnight. The government called the tariffs unlawful, but words couldn't restart the mills. Canada's steel towns were left in limbo, their future uncertain. The shockwaves didn't stop at the border. The disruption rippled through the entire North American supply chain, creating a domino effect that no one had anticipated. US auto manufacturers dependent on Canadian steel faced chaos as their supply dried up. The once bustling factories now stood eerily silent, with workers left in limbo. Domestic producers couldn't fill the gap overnight. The sudden surge in demand overwhelmed local steel mills, which were already operating at full capacity. By July 2025, auto assemblies had plummeted 16.4% in a single month. This sharp decline was unprecedented and sent shockwaves through the industry. Factories slowed, shifts were cancelled, and some lines shut down entirely. The impact was felt not just by the workers, but also by their families and communities. The bottleneck choked the entire manufacturing process, hitting not just big car brands but also smaller suppliers. Warehouses filled with unfinished vehicles, waiting for parts that might never arrive. Tier 1 and Tier 2 parts makers, reliant on Canadian steel, couldn't deliver. Their production lines ground to a halt, exacerbating the crisis. The ripple effect spread across the industry, threatening tens of thousands of jobs. Workers gathered in break rooms, discussing their uncertain futures. Ironically, a policy meant to protect American workers now put them at risk. Protests erupted as workers demanded answers and solutions. The assembly lines weren't just slowing, they were grinding to a halt. The silence in the factories was deafening, a stark contrast to the usual hum of machinery. The lifeblood of the US auto industry had been cut off. Steel, the essential material, was now a rare commodity. The cost was being felt everywhere. Dealerships faced empty lots, and consumers were left with fewer choices and higher prices. Behind the numbers are real people, families, workers, and entire communities. In Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie, layoffs at Algoma Steel meant more than lost jobs. They meant lost futures. Local businesses suffered as steelworkers stopped spending. Across the border, American parts factories faced their own crisis. Tariff bills soared, prices rose, and hours were cut. The promise of more US steel jobs rang hollow as auto workers faced layoffs. For every job created in steel, 75 were lost in steel-using sectors. The policy pitted steel workers against auto workers, but their fates were intertwined. When steel supply is choked, everyone loses. The human cost anxiety, lost livelihoods, and dreams put on hold. These aren't just statistics, they're families caught in a political crossfire. The faces behind the factory gates tell the real story of this trade war. With the US market closed, Canada's steel industry is betting big on green steel. Electric arc furnaces powered by clean energy are replacing coal-fired ones. The government is investing heavily. $420 million for Algoma's new furnace. The hope rebrand Canadian steel as a premium eco-friendly product. But green steel is costly, and car makers, already squeezed by tariffs, may not pay extra. The transition is slow and expensive, offering no quick fix for idle plants or lost jobs. Canada is fighting a war on two fronts, surviving today's trade war while investing in tomorrow's technology. The gamble. That global demand for green steel will rise before the industry bleeds out. While Canada protested, Mexico took a different approach. Facing the same 50% tariff threat, Mexico launched a crackdown on illegal steel imports, targeting companies accused of smuggling Asian steel. The high-profile shutdown of LAU Industries sent a message Mexico was serious about compliance. This move aimed to win goodwill in Washington and secure a tariff rate quota deal. A TRQ would let a set amount of Mexican steel enter the U.S. tariff-free, with the rest taxed heavily. Mexico's pragmatism contrasted with Canada's principled stance. By policing its steel market, Mexico positioned itself as a preferred partner. The outcome could reshape North American steel trade for years. Negotiations between the US and Canada have become a high-stakes game of chicken. The US won't back down easily, and Canada is preparing $90 billion in retaliatory measures and industry support. The best hope is a compromise, maybe a tariff rate quota like Mexico's. But even that would cap Canada's exports and mark a retreat from free trade. Canada is also prioritizing domestic steel in government projects, fighting back with its own policies. The aid package is a lifeline, but it diverts billions from other priorities. If the stalemate continues, both industries suffer. Canadian mills idle. US auto plants face shortages. The risk, a permanent restructuring of the North American auto industry and a deeper trade war. The fate of a continent's economy hangs in the balance. The negotiators are playing for very high stakes. Why does this matter to you? Because it's about to hit your wallet. Disrupted supply chains mean fewer cars and higher prices. The 16.4% drop in auto assemblies means tens of thousands of cars never built. Tariff costs get passed to buyers. Your next car could cost thousands more. This is a hidden tax on anyone needing a new vehicle. The crisis exposes how fragile our global supply chains really are. The Canadian steelworker, the American auto worker, and you, the car buyer, are all connected. The price of steel is now the price of your next car.